this is something that technology cannot solve on its own. Like you have to have much more empathy and compassion and insight into the human psychology, really understanding the emotional barriers that go into people kind of like having difficulty to change their behavior, and what are the mechanics that you can build into that.
Michal Levin, thank you for joining me on 20-Minute Leaders. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too. I'm so excited to talk about user experience with you. Like I mentioned, I didn't get to talk about it nearly enough in the 300 episodes we've had, and I'm super excited to dig deep into the importance of user experience in everything we do, both in tech, in startups, but in daily life as well. And before we get started, I have to say your experience with UX is remarkable. I think that I saw about a dozen different organizations that you've made an impact on in the world of UX, all the way from a startup like Zoox to a Google to Verily, and now a Hero. So tell me a little bit about your journey. How do you even get started with dealing with user experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. It goes quite a few years back. Actually, the story starts back in Israel, where I was born and raised. And after I finished my army service, I actually joined a company, and that's kind of like was my entry to the tech industry. And I actually joined as a QA, and I started working there. And back in the days, it was about probably about 15 to 20 years ago. UX in Israel wasn't an industry. There was no education around it. There were not a lot of companies that was doing that. It was just like early on, where mostly engineers were just like building the UIs based on kind of like what they thought was the right thing to do. And actually remember those early days where I was doing QA and I was testing the functionality of the product, but I kind of like started also asking just like intuitively all these questions as to why do we have all these menu items? Like, why does the workflow work like this? And I started just like within the culture of that company, we started talking about this idea of like usability and UI super early on. So that's kind of like was the early seeds. Then I actually went to a school and I started computer science and business management. However, halfway through my degree, I actually decided that computer science is not what I want to continue doing. I didn't see myself just like sitting and coding. Really wanted to see how I can bring more people-focused, creative doing into kind of like what I do in my career. So I paused. I started exploring kind of like what I want to do next. And I ended up actually going on a multiple route of psychology and communication as one bachelor degree. And I also continued my business management as the parallel path. And I continued with these two bachelor degrees. And I really enjoyed it. But then kind of like as I was studying, I was like, okay, what am I going to do with all these degrees? Like what does that translate to? And while I was in school, I kind of like went back to this like, there was this like UX thing that I kind of like started tackling back then, and it seemed super interesting. And it made me feel like this could be something that I'm good at, that really brings together this like, the cognitive psychology with technology. So honestly, what I ended up doing is one evening, I just opened Google and I just searched for all the UX companies in Israel, and I just applied to all of them. I wrote a cover letter explaining why I think bring value to that company, and I just like threw it out there. A couple of companies got back to me, started an interview process, and luckily enough, I landed in Zoox, which was kind of like one of the top design agencies in Israel. And that was actually my entry point. So, you go into an agency, it's just like all about like having a lot of UX people there. I worked there for almost 4 years, and I think I built a lot of just like hands-on experience and understanding working with like dozens and dozens of clients across so many different platforms, mobile and web and TV, and across like media and finance and gaming. And that gave me like so much experience with that. So that's kind of like how I started. From there, I actually joined Modu, which was founded by Dov Moran, one of kind of like the top entrepreneurs in Israel. And during my work at Modu, actually 9 months into my work there, I was approached by Google. And the funny story was that at the time, like I don't want to pursue that. Like I was very happy at Modu, and then a friend of mine said, like, what are you saying? Are you crazy? You know, get started, go through the hiring process. You can always say no at the end. So I started, and it ended up being a really long process. It was about 7 months of hiring process because it was the first UX hire in Israel. So I had like 14 interviews across, like around the world, on site, yeah. But during that time, 7 months of interviewing, you start getting excited about the opportunity, and it builds kind of like this psychological connection. And I ended up getting hired. And this is how I started my Google journey, which really kind of like accompanied me over the following decade. I spent 6.5 years with Google. I moved to the US through Google. I worked at Verily, and now I'm at Hero.
Unbelievable. You know, like I have to give the analogy. I never wanted to be a pilot. My father was a pilot, and when it came down to going to do the army testing, which we do in Israel, of course, I said, okay, they're inviting me to try. I knew that I didn't want to be a pilot, but all my friends said, well, Michael, you have to try. Like, you have to at least you have to see if you can make it. And I remember they sent me to the Gibush, which was one of the worst weeks of my life, and I'm traumatized by it until today because it was so difficult. By the end of it, when I was accepted, it was so hard to say no. Even though I didn't want to be a pilot, I felt like I just had to do it because I got through it. As if a testament to myself, but I have to give that analogy. And I think you said it wrong. You said that they had hired me. No, you said yes. That's what I think it more comes down to from what I'm gathering from the story. Michal, break it down for me. User experience. You mentioned the psychology, communication, computer science, this integration of understanding user behavior. Break it down for me. What is user experience, and why is it so fascinating to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. At the end of the day, it's kind of like it's starting with understanding, why are we doing this? You start with the why. I think that's kind of like one title, commonly associated with Simon Sinek. I think I kind of like very much relate to that. It's really like starting to think about what you're doing and what you're building by truly understanding what people need, what are their pain points, what are their mental models, behavior. Right. I think this is where the psychology really kind of like going deep into understanding what is the problem that you're trying to solve, what are the current barriers, what are the current pain points, and really starting from there, needs and goals, doing that analysis, really understanding the people and the audiences that you are trying to solve a problem for, and go from there. So it's not about starting with the technology and everything we can do, because the technology can do X and can do Y, which is what we call a tech-driven approach. It's a user-centered approach. It's like, let's understand what do people even need, and then see what is the best way to do that. And again, it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to do all the fancy stuff. We really need to hone in on what are the key needs. I think a good example for that, and for the kind of like how it manifests itself, I actually think the last couple of years working in healthcare is a really great example.
Michal, new background, new environment, same user experience, same question. Talking about healthcare a little bit from your experience as well. Well, why is your experience with healthcare an interesting example of the importance of user experience?
Yeah, I think it's a really great example of the difference between technology focused approach and user-centered approach, because there's a lot of like promising technologies and things that we can do, machine learning and AI, and we can build all these like amazing tools and do sophisticated things. But when you actually try to innovate within healthcare, what you realize that oftentimes, when you try to build tools for like health systems, physicians, the secret and what would actually get you to change and move the needle is how well you can integrate into their existing workflows. So if you start building all these like amazing tools, but they're actually a separate tool that they need to log into, that they need to open, that they need to learn, that is a huge barrier for adoption. And oftentimes the innovation would come by like finding the ways that you can integrate into their EHR. And even if the EHR UX is not great, this is where they're at. And you need to find the creative ways of integrating yourself there and being in as part of their workflows and seeing how through there you can bring value to them. So oftentimes it's not necessarily like all the amazing, beautiful technology that we can build independently, is really finding the way to tapping yourselves into their busy schedule and really understanding that they have like 5 minutes a day to take a look at these things. And if you want to squeeze yourself within their daily routine, it's not going to be with building a whole other tool that is outside of their kind of like habits.
I think that's a fascinating example because it's the entrepreneurial mindset of any, especially young entrepreneurs, saying, okay, we have this idea, we want to make an all-around beautiful product with our own login screen and our own user experience, and we're so excited to show this all-encompassing product when, if we forget a little bit about the customer that at the end needs to use the product and what their behavior is and how are we fitting into their behavior, then we might have this crazy misalignment where nobody can even use your product because you're not aligning to what they actually need. Why isn't the engineer in the room or the product manager in the room enough to understand this? Why is there a specific role called user experience? Why is there this function within a company? Why isn't it enough that engineers just think critically about their customers and just adapt to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would start by saying that, again, like the culture that I've been raised on and I truly believe in is it's not like the UX person is the only one that solves all the problems. I think it's like continuously collaborative process where we work together, engineering and product and UX, bringing all the considerations together, thinking through user problems. I think it's important across the organization, whether you're a product manager, engineer, regulatory person, to have a shared understanding of what are we building, why are we building, who are our users. So I think this is actually something that culturally need to be shared. I think in terms of like when do we need it, like why do we need a dedicated role? I think it's just a full-time job to do that work well. And at the end of the day, it's just like any role. Like, why do we need PGMs? Like, can't a PM be a PGM? In some scenarios, yes. Like, people can build that skill set. I think it's just like at the end of the day, like, you have a limited bandwidth, there's work to be done, and if you want to do it well, you need dedicated resources that can have the bandwidth to do it. So if a PM needs to, like, a PM can also code, while not them, the engineers, right? Well, because if they need to code, they're going to need to spend half the day on it, so they don't have the time to collect the business requirements and do, like, landscape analysis and talk to customers. So I don't think it's necessarily, like, people that have, like, a specific superpower that others cannot learn or gain. It's more about how do you build a healthy organization where you put your resources on the key things that have to be, super thoughtful, go deep, and truly understand, so we do build the best product.
I think that's fascinating. And one of the things that I'm always asking myself in the context of user experience is, the way that I think about user experience to some degree is thinking, okay, we have this intuition about how we should approach solving the problem for our users. And user experience professionals can help us navigate that intuition into practicality and research data-driven analysis of what actually do our users need and how can we use our intuition to navigate there. And one of the things that I'm always asking myself is, how do you even know that there's a problem, right? How do you know that, if I have 100 functions within a company, and I'm guessing, within Google and Verily and those different companies you've been a part of, there were many, many aspects where user experience was important. How can, the CEO, the engineer, or the product manager even pinpoint the parts where a user experience professional may be of use?
Yeah. Well, I think kind of like, as you said, it starts with like research and really understanding what we're trying to solve. So I think every entrepreneur, every CEO, every product manager, they usually start their initiative by observing a problem, by observing, an unsolved need or a need that is not being solved well enough. And then in order for you to tackle it differently, so you sometimes, if you went through this personally, you already have some insights around, what you experience as being like the key barriers or the key gaps. If you're trying now to kind of say, okay, how do we build a scaled product out of that? You need to do kind of like go deeper and see how much is your experience actually applicable more broadly. You want to understand what are the target audience that apply to that. And there's a lot of research that needs to go into understanding kind of like more deeply, what does that entail? So again, like where are the problems coming from, what are people's expectations, as well as, in an ongoing way, as you develop the product, whether it's based on your intuitions and kind of like your ideas, you want to validate that. And again, you need people that can go and thoughtfully do that. So, there's like different approaches. Oftentimes people just think that they can go to people and say, would you like this feature? Would you find this feature useful? Which again, kind of like for a lot of people, it feels like intuitive to do, but that actually doesn't generate any viable results. Because whenever you ask anybody if they want this or that, they will usually say yes. Because why not if we can get more? There's a lot more that goes into it, because what you end up seeing that people use maybe 10% of the features that you offer them, because at the end of the day, when they actually use the product and there's trade-offs, whether in terms of like complexity and time and all those things, they're not going to use it. So you do need to have particular skills to do the research well, so you gain the right insight that you can rely on. Also, you really want to have kind of like a holistic approach that look at qualitative data and quantitative data. And again, like doing all of that, takes time, requires expertise. Also, how do you design things well? Like how there's a whole like investment now, and this is an area that I'm also like super excited about, is like this whole idea of behavior change. And I think that's another angle that to me represents how important UX is, because we see it again in healthcare, but everywhere. You can build all the most amazing devices, whether it's, wearables or like all the crazy stuff that we see that is amazing. But between having an amazing device and getting people to use it every day, there is a big gap, right? This is why we see that like obesity is like more prevalent than ever. And like changing behavior with people is so hard. I think this is something that technology cannot solve on its own. Like you have to have much more empathy and compassion and insight into the human psychology, really understanding the emotional barriers that go into people kind of like having difficulty to change their behavior, and what are the mechanics that you can build into that. So to me, that's another area where I see healthcare, like UX is critical to really change people's behavior at scale. It's still an unresolved problem. UX is critical, and I think this is where I see a lot of the value that comes by really going deep on these areas.
It's fascinating beyond belief. I just read a really interesting article by one of my former bosses, Kristen Berman from the Irrational Lab, one of Dan Ariely's projects, and she was talking about the vaccine, like thinking about the COVID-19 vaccine and the user experience behind that whole distribution. And now we're in this situation where we need like 75% of the world to take this shot, voluntarily, in order to resolve this pandemic. And it's fascinating, I think, thinking of behavioral economics and how, and you see prime ministers going on live television, doing it themselves. Like that's a part of the user experience journey, right? And I'm really wondering sometimes how much thought really is put into these critical things. And I have a hunch that it's not enough. And we need more people like you to help advise these different things. But that's fascinating. Michal, we don't have much time, but give me a few key insight nuggets for the young entrepreneur of how to approach solving user experience issues or intuitions as they build their company, whether it's for B2B or B2C, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that could be a topic for an entire conversation. I think I would go back to kind of like where I started, where it starts with why. And I think this is also, when I interview UX people, when I look for UX people, I start with like looking at the critical thinking and the problem solving skills before the visual aesthetic and the ability to design a screen well. You really want to have people keep asking why, really understanding, like, why are we doing that? Why are we doing it this way? Can we simplify it? Like really keep asking this why. And it's pretty interesting. I have 2 toddlers, and I think those behaviors, they ask why like 10 times on everything. They go, but why? And as a parent, it can sometimes be challenging, but I think that's the right mindset. And I think over time along the way, we start asking those deep whys. But I think that those whys and going like 3 whys in, the first principle approach, really understanding why we need a certain things and how can we do it better? I think this is where innovation starts from. So that would be kind of like my top advice in terms of the mindset, because I think it starts with the mindset. And the more you ask those why, I think this is where you start kind of like thinking about things differently. The other thing I would say is while I think like personal experience is many times kind of like provides good intuition as to where we need to go. We do need to remind ourselves like you are not the user in most cases. Right. So we need to be humble. We need to make sure that we're not making too strong assumptions based on our own experience, and take the time to truly try and understand the audience that we are targeting and where are they coming from and what are their challenges, and making sure that we have the empathy and we really incorporate that into how we approach the product, and we validate and we learn, because things are changing all the time. So yeah.
I think that's just inspiring. So thank you, Michal, for that. 3 words that you would use to describe yourself. My favorite question.
Okay, so 3 words. I'm gonna cheat a little bit because I'm gonna use a 2 word for each one. But you know, we can assume there was a hyphen there. So theoretically speaking, it's 1. I think one thing about myself that characterizes me, I think, in everything that I do and also my career, is just like people focused. I think it all starts with the people, hiring the right people, building the right relationships, being really people focused, seeing kind of like what people need, how you can, you know, grow them, how do we work with them as peers. That's going to be 1. The second is growth minded. I think constantly, like I seek feedback, I seek growth. Like I want to grow as an individual. I want to grow as a professional. I am a big believer in the approach of atomic habits, you know, get 1% better every day. So I really do seek those avenues of growth constantly. And the last thing I would say is daring greatly, which is a concept that has kind of like become more popular with Brené Brown books, which I absolutely admire. I think she's brilliant, and she, like, the type of messages that she's trying to kind of like disseminate are so important around vulnerability and, you know, kind of like imperfection. But to me, that's kind of like this idea of like being in the arena, you know, fighting, putting in the blood and sweat and failing and overcoming, you know, obstacles until kind of like you ideally succeed, but really kind of like not just critique and point kind of like from the side on what's not working, but really being there and trying and working hard for like worthy outcomes and do your best.
I just love that. Michal, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I appreciate your time so much. I know how busy you are. And all I can say is stay safe and stay healthy. And thank you for the amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.